Herkese merhaba. Uluslararası Taner Yelkenci Hukuk ve Devlet Teorisi Sempozyumu'nun ikinci gününün öğleden sonrası oturumuna hoş geldiniz. Bu oturumda bizlerle Gonzalo Pozo-Martin birlikte olacak. Gonzalo Pozo-Martin doktorasını Londra Üniversitesi School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies bölümünde tamamladı. Rusya ve NATO örneği vakası üzerinden uluslararası jeopolitik rekabet üzerine bir çalışma yaptı ve burada jeopolitika çalışmalarının Marksist bir analizi perspektifini sundu. Ki Marksizm ve jeopolitika tartışmaları üzerine bir kitabı yakında Pluto Press'ten yayınlanacak. Daha sonra King's College'da ekonomi politik dersleri verdi. Şu anda ise İsveç'te Stockholm Üniversitesi'nde ekonomi politik alanındaki çalışmalarını sürdürüyor. Yine yakın zamanda editörlüğünü üstlendiği, kendisinin de makalesinin yer aldığı iki kitabı var. Uluslararası Eleştirel Ekonomi Politik El kitabı ve arası siyaseti üzerine. Ama bunun yanında çok önemli bir başka tutkusu, ünlü Troçki biyografisinin yazarı, Polonyalı tarihçi, Marksist entelektüel Isaac Deutscher'in çok kapsamlı bir biyografisi üzerine çalışıyor şu anda. Arşive dayalı bir çalışma bu. Bugün bize İspanya'nın sürekli geçişi, post-franco rejiminin sınıfsal temelleri ve sınırları başlıklı bildirisini sunacak. Kendisine teşekkür ediyoruz.
Okay, well, is that hearable? Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to say it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. And I want to say a special mention, express thanks to the Kocaeli Culture Center, the Kampflat magazine, and the Union of Teachers, and the Union of Architects and Engineers. I think I've got those right. But my sincere thanks to all these groups for the invitation. And it's also a special pleasure to be talking about something which isn't included in my academic CV or my normal list of areas of expertise, which is Spanish politics. For different reasons, I've been able to spend the last few months of my life with my family in my country, and a lot of things are happening there, as you know, a lot of interesting things, I think a lot of important things, and maybe a lot of hopeful things are happening as well. And they throw up a lot of questions and a lot of issues about the shape of the left, the prospects of the left, European politics, and in general, the possibility of harnessing discontent to positive and effective political platforms. Although, of course, this is all, as you know, a work in progress. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in Spain, but a number of these elements will be spelled out as I go on. And now I want to start with the talk proper. In a kind of strange way, I want to start by quoting Franco, Generalissimo Franco, who, of course, was a very cruel, authoritarian leader, but had a great sense of humor. So he combined that with his normal political work. There's a couple of excellent examples of his wit. There was, for instance, in the 1950s, the chief editor of one of the regime's newspapers called Arriba, associated to, if you like, the more secular, very right-wing forces of the Franco regime, the Falangists. He'd been receiving some pressure on his editorial lines, and this guy went to Franco and complained and said, look, I'm receiving all kinds of pressure, and Franco said, don't worry, and do as I do, just never get involved in politics. This was his response. On another famous occasion, somebody came to him to complain about an instance of censorship in a film, and his response was equally nonchalant. He said, I know, but have you ever met anyone who's as stupid as a censor? And so on. And the instances of Franco's sense of humor came up to the very end of his regime. I believe it was the last cabinet meeting that he chaired before his death. Some of his ministers were expressing their misgivings, their fear, that the very, very timid reforms that Franco was putting in place, and the way in which he was preparing the country for a situation without him, he went to assure his ministers that everything was going to be safely continuing along the lines that he'd set since the Spanish Civil War. In particular, he told the incumbent minister, he said, "Don't worry, I'm going to leave everything tied up and well tied up." And I think this is expressive of the way in which Franco's figure and Franco's political system and economic system continues to hang like a long shadow over Spanish politics 30, 40 years after his death, his timely death. So that in two ways. First of all, it's not exactly clear that the political transition and all the kinds of arrangements and agreements that were made more or less a little before Franco's death up until 1978, when the new democratic constitution was brought into being. It's not exactly clear that they effected a break with the past. And this runs diametrically counter to what Spaniards like me, who were born in those days, have grown up to believe, that we were living now in a democracy, whereas before we had a completely different kind of political regime. Now, it's clearly the case that Spain is for lack of a better word, a modern European democracy now. The discontinuities between then and Franco's regime are very numerous and very clear. But nevertheless, there's specific contours of the Franco regime that persisted, and that in a sense explains why Spanish politics have been so deeply thrown into turmoil over the last 4 or 5 years. This is a crisis of Spanish politics that can't just be explained in terms of, say, the effects of the global economic crisis and its impact in Spain, or some other specific moment of crisis in the political system. There are things that Franco left tied down, and well tied down, as he put it. But those things are rupturing now. So the transition, in a sense, can be seen as something that is perpetually, or at least still, being reassessed. The other way in which Franco and the transition continue to loom over Spanish politics is the sense that every single politician that has a shot at winning an election in Spain has to present himself still as completing the transition of, there have been different formulations, and this is both in the right and in the left. So, for instance, Aznar in 1994, so 2 years before he became the country's prime minister, wrote a book called La Segunda Transición, the Second Transition, and guess what? Pablo Iglesias, very recently, published a book called Una Nueva Transición, a new transition. The transition, which is supposed to be a model transition from authoritarian politics to a democratic system, and was supposed to have been something that finally had allowed Spaniards to overcome the violence of the past, the division of the country in the past, etc. That is still something that politically makes a comeback very continuously. And of course, I mean, in a very literal sense, Franco's politics has not been deleted from the Spanish political map, and needless to say that there's an element, there's a root of the Conservative Party in Spain, which still finds its own continuity, political, ideological, and personal, with the last phase of Franco's rule. So in many, many ways, the Francoist regime and the post-Francoist regime have had a very messy succession. And they feed in very radically into what is going on in Spain now. I just want to go firstly through some of the characteristics of the Franco regime that I want to stress because of their continuity. Things that the transition did not address, things that the transition did not eradicate, things that are not a clean break after 1978 from Franco's dictatorship, and things which open up limits to the political system in Spain today that some new political actors are trying to address. Then I'm going to try and speak about the nature of the rupture, of the moment in which the regime, the post-Franco regime, the tenuously post-Franco regime, got into trouble. And citizens in Spain did not find a real response in the official menu of political choices on offer. And then I'm going to say something about the strategy of the left, and of course I'm going to allude to state theory, which of course in the end is the theoretical point that brings us here. So in many ways, Franco did set up the image of Spain, set up an image of Spain to the image of his own political regime already from the 60s. So Spain in the 60s began to open up to the world market. There was a kind of replacement of the technical cadres of the state, in particular for economic policy and so on. Spain ended its isolation after the Civil War and after World War II. And that initiated a process of industrialization, a takeoff, an industrial takeoff in Spain, which had very deep consequences. The key consequence of this process was the development of a Spanish middle class. Here we have, I guess, a divorce between a sociological reality, a changing sociological reality in the 60s and 70s in Spain, and a political narrative from the left that is trying to catch up with that process. The Communist Party in Spain had been in clandestinity all throughout Franco's regime and has taken upon itself, in a sense, to heroically fight for democracy and against the Francoist dictatorship. When the first elections finally took place in the end of the 70s, the Communist Party, even though it was presenting a very minimal program, not at all a maximalist transformation program, but a program of minimal guarantees, minimal social guarantees, and so on. And critically, the Communist Party had given up on the type of state. The Communist Party, by the end of the 70s, had given up the vindication of a republic. I'll point out in a second why I think this is very relevant. Nevertheless, the Communist Party, despite all its efforts, despite all its effort to adapt also in the 70s, found itself receiving a very, very bad electoral result, engulfed by another party, the Socialist Party, which then, within the span of very few years, became Spain's ruling party until the mid-90s and again into the 2000s. The Socialist Party had been absent, had been largely absent from the political struggles against Franco within Spain. This had been a party essentially that had been in exile in France. But they managed to disembark in the 70s and early 80s in Spain as an entirely renewed party, young, a party that had abandoned the explicit references to Marxist programmatic demands already in the mid-70s through the leader of Felipe González and a young group of politicians around him. And it's very interesting that if you look at the trajectory of the Socialist Party at this moment, in the moment of the transition, a lot of the things they did, and they said, were very evocative of what Podemos now does and says. In particular, they had a genius approach to the electoral contest. They were much more able to harness electoral support. But I think critically and most of all, they had read the signs better than the Communist Party. The Socialist Party had understood that Spanish society had changed and that there had been the development of a middle class to which a message, a much more temperate message, like the one they were putting forward, was much more attractive. The Communist Party thought it would bank on its historical efforts against Francoism and had failed to see that the makeup of Spanish society had changed drastically. In a very important sense also, this is not just a change in the class composition of the Spanish society in the 70s. Economically, this had been done in a way that we're still dealing with the consequences of. Since the 60s, the Spanish economic policy had tried to develop building, the construction sector, and had tried to foster the development of a class of private property owning tenants. So that if you compare the rate of private tenancy in Spain to flats that are owned in first property by Spaniards, they're much higher than the European average. And they also encourage ownership of a second home and so on and so forth. So the takeoff and the industrialization of the 60s very quickly gave way to a situation in which, through all kinds of helps and direction from the state, many Spanish citizens access the possession of property, of a residency. This feeds in then with a sense of Spaniards looking forward to the purchase of flats, and feeds back into the construction boom that then different governments during the democracy fostered themselves, contributing to the construction boom towards 2006 that lent a particular modulation to the global economic crisis in Spain. So that the way in which the global crisis hit Spain had everything to do with a very specific model of development around a middle class, a bulging middle class of private property owners, of people with flats and so on, since the 60s. The structure, the economic structure of the Franco regime did not in any way radically change. Whereas we had different negotiations and pacts that tried to institutionalize democracy in Spain. Nothing like that happened in terms of economic power, economic policy. There were, of course, a number of agreements and a number of deals around the Moncloa Pact, the so-called Moncloa Pact, by a number of forces to try to provide some welfare content to post-Francoist politics in Spain. But it was very clearly, from the outset, going to be one where wage struggles and organized working struggles were going to be downplayed, and where flexibility was going to become one of the themes of the new politics in place. And first, of course, when the Socialist Party finally came into power with an absolute majority in 1982, a majority that it held for 2 years afterwards, 13 years of uncontinued rule by Felipe González. Well, the key first step there was the accession to the European Common Market, where the Spanish economy then was harnessed to a superior stratum of economic imperatives that were going to further dictate flexibilization and integrate, liberalization of trade relations with the European Union and so on. And the explosion of that is Spain joining the euro, with many other countries at the end of the 90s. That subsumed the Spanish economy within a framework of very unequal exchanges commercial and financial exchanges within the heart of Europe. In particular, it harnessed the Spanish economy very directly to the needs of the German core of the economic setup of the European Union. And, well, this is, I don't want to rehearse one of the explanations for the euro crisis that has been expounded, but essentially one of the ways in which the German state was able to keep German wages relatively stagnant while gaining competition and benefiting from an export-oriented economy, enormous amounts of reserves in exchange and so on, was to pass, if you like, a big amount of debt into the Spanish economy and to encourage an enormous amount of indebtedness into the Spanish economy, which Spanish citizens and banks were very happy to participate with, partly also because of this element that I've outlined and originating in Franco's economic policy about property ownership and so on. So there was an impetus to get into debt to buy property and fuel the construction boom, but also release some of the economic pressure on Germany through the euro. So these contradictions are not new. They don't just emanate in the particular way in which the Spanish economy hooked up to the European economy. They have a larger sort of background that goes all the way back to Franco. And of course, Franco's Spain was a capitalist economy, and from the 60s, a relatively well-developed and internationally integrated economy, specializing, I've mentioned construction, but specializing also in the tourism industry and so on. So, and with very much a class element. This class element pervaded the transition arrangements. New actors made it into the fore of Spanish politics. The relevance of free trade unions was very important. The appearance of center-left or left-wing parties into the normal flow of politics after 1978 was very prominent. But the Spanish economy continued to be framed by essentially an organized and, I think, self-aware group of capitalist interests that were able to still have an enormous amount of influence of the state over the state, and to continue directing Spain's openness into the European project more broadly. So that never disappeared with Franco's death in 1975 or with the transition process. And it also, finally, just to mention a couple of things that survived the transition. There was in particular a very specific set of patrimonial, if you like, attitudes towards the Spanish state, which anybody who picks up a newspaper in Spain today will continue seeing. The way in which there's a whole clique, in the language of Podemos, this is a caste of members of the economic elite that feel that they have absolute, undiluted access to the state for their own benefit and exert their access and their influence over the state to profit in the most ravenous and unashamed way. I could bore you, I could make a whole lecture just reading to you corruption scandal after corruption scandal. I think those are very important, and I have to come back to one or two aspects of that in the next few minutes. But what most of all these corruption scandals are permanently confirming is the sense that there is a class of people in Spain that take pride in the fact that they can skew different political processes to their economic benefit. A bunch of businessmen who collude with local authorities in the adjudication of land, for instance, for different development projects or for construction of different kinds of buildings and so on, that end up in secret meetings and in offices counting money, where with little bags with €500 bills are handed over between politicians and businessmen on a regular basis, and where entire campaigns, political campaigns, in this case by the conservatives, have been funded from corrupt networks of exchanges. But all this harks back to a sense that the state is the legitimate property, and if not the legitimate property, then the kind of legitimate playground of a number of very well articulated business interests. Now, I don't want to dramatize. I am Spanish, but I don't want to dramatize. And I don't want to make it seem like Spain is an entirely corrupt country. There are elements of the transition that have been relatively successful. The judiciary has been relatively successful, for instance, in taking some action against these corrupt networks. The security forces have undoubtedly come a long way since the 70s into the service of state and so on. But there are a number of legal ambiguities and just a lasting political attitude towards the state that hasn't been redefined. And the center-right in Spain feels this is a natural order of things. The center-left in Spain feels this is perhaps not the natural order of things, but it cannot be shaken too much. It is maybe reformable, but it cannot be eradicated. And the best chance for a progressive agenda, as far as the Socialist Party is concerned, is to sort of play within those limits, right? While at the same time upholding that the Spanish transition has been a world-class example of peaceful, happy transitions, including the Eastern European transitions from communism and other parts of the world. So we have to still think about the Spanish transition as a model transition in that sense. Also, the Spanish transition is supposed to have inaugurated the longest period of prosperity and economic security that Spaniards have ever enjoyed, and so on and so forth. And that without civil war, without civil strife, etc., etc. So the transition was then incomplete, and it was also based on a number of things that should not be touched. In particular, historical memory and the crimes of Francoism should not, this is the transition consensus, should not have become the center of any real political debate. The most tragic example of this is the fact that well over 100,000 people in Spain are still missing from the violence of the Civil War. And the Spanish state still cannot find a way of articulating a legal response to that, so that the relatives, people like me who have relatives lost on the side of some road, shot at the back in some kind of reprisal action during the Civil War, cannot reclaim the lost members of the family and cannot put their names visibly again in a gravestone or whatever. That is one of the things that the transition didn't touch, and the transition was also based on a very dubious amnesty law, which essentially meant that those that had committed torture and had tortured and very violently reprised the opponents of Franco rule, particularly in the 60s and 70s, those were not going to be brought to justice. So there was a kind of start over policy, which most political forces accepted. This is another thing that the Spanish transition didn't sort out. But in much more contemporary relevance, the territorial question in Spain, which is now open again, with a very real possibility of a process of independence, leading to the away of Catalonia from the rest of the Spanish state, was never settled by the transition. Here, the story is quite incredible, and it's quite telling of how patchy the transition was in reality. Even though we are taught that the transition is the product of these great men, generous men, men who had the long vision, men who were able to responsibly and maturely make pacts with the opposite, to put their differences away, and so on. In fact, the political arrangements that led to the post-Franco regime, to the institutional legal contours of the post-Franco regime, were very messy. So take the territorial question. What kind of state is Spain according to the constitution? And this is a key question, of course, for instance, in deciding whether a regional government like Catalonia has a right to organize a referendum for independence, or organize even any kind of consultation about, do Catalans want to have a referendum? Well, the deliberations within the specific commission in Parliament dealing with that aspect of the Constitution, well, they went for hours, and there's thousands and thousands of documents that are available and you can consult them that sort of give you the minutes of those deliberations. You have all the agenda for those meetings. In those meetings, the Basque nationalists, the Catalonian nationalists, put their position that maybe the constitution should recognize the fact that Spain is a country with different nationalities, and different nations, different positions. The conservatives did the same, the socialists did the same, the communists did the same, and so on. And while they were deliberating, a note came in, read by the chair, the person presiding the negotiations at that moment. The note came, he interrupted the proceedings and read out the note. What he read out was the current formulation of Article 2 of the Constitution that establishes what kind of territory Spain is. And that has come from a military authority. In other words, the current description of the nationalities question and the territorial integrity of the Spanish state was not the product of a political agreement, of a political deal. It had come from the military, it was read, and then fantastically all political parties there represented voted for it. And I think this is something that is easily forgotten, and of course lands a massive constitutional question about the integrity, the future integrity of the Spanish state today. All these things combine in order to effect an increasing, slow, quiet, but growing separation between Spanish civil society and the political system. In the political system up to 2010, 2011, you could barely see clear dividing lines. Sociologically, if you came from a left or center-left tradition, you'd cast your vote in one direction. If you were religious and center-right and so on, you cast your vote in the other direction. But the political situation wasn't moving, while in places like Catalonia, the very integrity of the state was being put into question, while the economic crisis was clearly giving the line to the fact, to this idea that the transition had made us all more prosperous. I mean, the impacts of the crisis had been very dramatic, especially in a society that had been encouraged to believe that they were very well off by the mid-2000s. A deeply indebted society, and so on. So no answers to the political question, no answers to the economic effects of the crisis, and no answers to the territorial problems faced by the Spanish state. And a lot of political bickering, who really could only interest those who were members of the parties involved in that bickering, but it was completely infertile. And the central-right increasingly renewing majorities and being able to govern Spain quite seamlessly. So what you have is, in the middle of May of 2011, an organic crisis in a Gramscian sense. The representation of a total divorce between the political class, even the center-left, and the rest of Spanish society, who found no answers. Are you looking at me ominously to tell me it's coming to an end? Okay. So a complete divorce between civil society and the Spanish state. The indignados, the way in which they took to the Plaza Mayor, if you've been to Madrid, and then to different squares all over Spain, in Bilbao, in Barcelona, with different degrees of successes, but all across the Spanish geography. This rupture was entirely unorganized. It was spontaneous. A number, of course, of civil platforms, neighbors, groups, the activists that are always there, and so on. All these people were there, but nobody had organized these protests themselves. And the messages coming out of these protests had completely flooded the capacity of response from the political establishment. I mean, one of the most visible and extremely ridiculous examples of this is the government's delegation in Madrid trying to deal with the central square in Madrid being occupied, not knowing what to do. One day saying they should be evicted. Another day saying, well, okay, just don't be too violent. Another day, etc., etc. The political establishment, while trying to say, we understand that people are very disappointed, we understand that people are hurting, we understand that people have demands, they could not put anything credible to Spanish citizenry. And now, of course, within the indignados, there was a layer of very well-trained activist cadres. From them, of course, you have a group of people in Madrid. This group of people is perhaps best understood as around Pablo Iglesias, but really a number of, less than 100 activists, maybe, mostly Marxists, who were very centered around the political department, political sciences department in Complutense University, who started thinking about seriously, what does this mean? This is an organic crisis, a divorce of citizenry from the political system. There is no political option that is going to ever credibly benefit electorally from this. It was a rejection in full. So, of course, in time coming, they prepared, they have been working very, very intensively how politics and the media work, and they were able to very adeptly work the media against the main mediatic messages, and eventually in January 2014, with a view to the European elections in May 2014, they formed a party in record time. They had an absolutely minimal budget, a completely ridiculous budget, electoral budget, compared to the other main parties. Nobody thought they were going to get at most any one Eurodeputee, and they were a big surprise. They did far, far better than any polls or any survey had anticipated. There's an important element of this in a symbolic way. Until then, the Spanish state could rest on its laurels, could say the Spanish state is the product of a transition out of a dictatorship. If anybody is unhappy with what is going on, if anybody doesn't see that this is a democratic, healthy state, they can join politics and transform politics from the institutions, because they're democratic enough to incorporate that. And that is, in a sense, the kind of bargain that Podemos took. Podemos saw the challenge and took it up, and has been extremely successful, and mostly through the very successful use of media. As I say, they have a group of people who are experts on how the media work, and they're very adept at monopolizing the limelight, breaking political messages by polarizing them, presenting new situations and so on, new messages. So what the rise of Podemos has done is to change at least the landscape of parliamentary politics in Spain, which went from a typical bipartisan system. Spain was never literally bipartisan, because there were, of course, smaller nationalist groups. There was a communist left-wing coalition, the United Left, and there were other small groups around the country that had a presence in parliament. but it was by an 80% of votes and seats, depending on the specific election. The socialists and the conservatives completely dominated Spain. This is no longer the case. So it fractured the bipartisan image, landscape of Spanish parliamentary politics. Secondly, it raised alarms for the establishment, for the economic elite. And this economic elite has also tried to create a kind of center-right Podemos party that is not associated with the more, the more old-fashioned, traditional views of the Conservative Party. This is Ciudadanos, a party that thinks of itself as purely center party, thinks of itself as a kind of liberal Democrats in England, some kind of equivalent to that, but clearly puts forward an economic policy that it's very difficult to disassociate from that of the Conservative Party, but also defends the territorial unity of the Spanish state and is very vocal. This is in effect a party that was born very much in Catalonia and has always made its policy to go against the referendum and go against independentism in Catalonia. So Spain went from having two hegemonic parties, which in some cases were very difficult to distinguish. Remember that it was the Socialist Party that, for the second time only in democratic history, effected a reform of the constitution to include budgetary discipline. That was the Socialists who did that. And now we have a situation where four groups are contending the political space. We just come from a general election. It has been enabled, the political forces have been enabled to coordinate some kind of government coming out of the very fragmented parliamentary landscape from those elections. The role of the Socialist Party here has been very, very critical. Electorally, the Socialist Party speaks to the left. When it came to trying to negotiate a government for change, to evict the right-wing Conservative Party, and so on, it chose to make a deal with Ciudadanos and then lock itself into that deal. And this was obviously a deal that Podemos and other forces of the left could not join. So, in some very understandable way, because the Socialist Party is still very, very fragile, very sensitive to economic pressures from the elite, the Socialist Party handed it over to the right-wing Popular Party, the Conservatives, to carry on in power, at least to the new elections, which we'll be having next month. Meantime, Podemos is posed, I think, to in the next round of elections, perhaps to take over the Socialist Party, if not in terms of a percentage of the votes, definitely, if not in terms of the distribution of the seats in Parliament, because our electoral laws are very skewed in different ways, at least to take over the Socialist Party in terms of the percentage of votes that they might receive. Only 20 minutes left. Okay, that's good. So this is a very new and promising situation where the Socialist Party might in effect become a kind of junior partner to Podemos, to a new party. And then the possibilities from there are open. Podemos, as you might know, will not stand on these elections alone. They will go to these elections hand in hand with something called popular unity, which comes from the old Communist Party-centered Alliance United Left. The United Left, in terms of vote percentages, has always come third, classically as the third most voted party in Spanish politics. But because of the particulars of the electoral vote, and because of the different provinces and districts where they get their votes, they never get more than a handful of seats. And in the last elections, say, the Socialists got over 5 million votes, Podemos got 5 million votes, Podemos and the confluences, But this united left, having got more than 1 million votes, only received 2 seats. So this is a party that is very punished by the electoral laws of the Spanish state. But in terms of votes, it's still an important party to play with. So Podemos and this popular unity will come together in this election, still not clear in exactly what way. And although some of the lists, some of the electoral lists, and some of the names that will run have already been publicized. But there are issues about logos and presentation and different campaigns and so on that are still being discussed. But they will come together to this election. The combination of these two parties is very likely to give the sorpaso to the socialist government. In that situation, then something quite unprecedented is open. First of all, a party that is less than 2 years old can reasonably have a chance at forming government. Second of all, this party's program is very different from the Socialist Party's program, and it's much more of a strong, I would say, a strong social democratic political program for Spanish politics. Among the main points of this program is a strong stance vis-à-vis Europe in terms of negotiating the debt and the different implementations of austerity. In fact, it rejects austerity as an exit out of the crisis. If Podemos and Popular Unity in this confluence obtain a bigger percentage of the votes, whatever happens in terms of seats in the parliament, then the Socialist Party has the option, or will have the definitely will be invited to be the junior partner in a coalition government to try to oust the right-wing Conservative Party and to try to implement a program of deep social welfare reform. Secondly, Podemos, in that situation, in a situation where the Socialist Party might be a junior partner in a coalition for its government, will defend the right for the Catalans to have a referendum on their independence. Because on their analysis, it's the state's negative answer to having a referendum that is mostly responsible for the rise in independentism in Catalonia over the last 10 years. Catalonian nationalists have never been as predominantly independentists as they have been since the mid-2000s. And this is very clearly correlated to the very hyper-nationalist Spanish stance taken by the Spanish state. So we have a potentially new situation in terms of negotiating the territorial makeup of the state. All this requires all kinds of debates and reforms, deep reforms of the Constitution. I've mentioned this before. The Constitution has only been amended twice. The first was a technical thing, just to adapt the Spanish Constitution to homogenize legally the Spanish Constitution with Maastricht and the European Union. The second in 2010, in the middle of August, where no one was paying attention, to introduce budgetary discipline as a constitutional demand. And all kinds of new constitutional reforms will have to be negotiated now, not just about the territorial makeup of the state, critically, for instance, about electoral laws. And that the electoral law favors the center-right in many ways, geographically, and also it tends to overweigh, it tends to give an overproportion to votes in the countryside, where the left is, of course, traditionally less successful in Spain. So that will have to be altered. And there's, for the first time, the real ability to lock into the Spanish Constitution real guarantees for social protection. This is, in a sense, a very minimal program in that it simply presents itself as trying to get the Spanish Constitution to live up to its most progressive aspects and to try to make sure that no one can work around the Constitution in those senses. But it is a very fundamental change in Spanish politics, and furthermore, it comes after